The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Kensington Palace as Catherine walked toward the waiting car. To anyone watching, it was just another royal engagement. Another day in the carefully choreographed life of the Princess of Wales. But Officer James Mitchell, standing at his post near the main entrance, noticed something the cameras didn't catch. The way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her coat. The barely perceptible pause before she stepped forward. Before we continue with this incredible true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss these powerful real-life stories that remind us of the human side behind every headline. James had been part of the Royal Protection Command for 8 years. He'd trained extensively, not just in physical defense, but in reading people, understanding threats, recognizing when something was wrong, even when everything appeared right. It was a skill that had been honed through countless hours of observation, through studying behavioral patterns, through learning to trust his instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. The previous night had been difficult. Catherine had attended a formal dinner where the pressure of public scrutiny felt heavier than usual. The tabloids had been particularly cruel that week, publishing stories that dissected every aspect of her appearance. Her parenting choices, her relationship with other family members. Words like struggling and isolated had appeared in bold headlines, accompanied by photos taken from unflattering angles. Moments captured when she thought no one was watching. She'd maintained her composure throughout the dinner, as she always did. Years of royal training had taught her how to smile through discomfort, how to engage in pleasant conversation even when her mind was elsewhere, how to project an image of grace and stability no matter what turmoil existed beneath the surface. But James had seen her afterward, in the brief moment when she thought she was alone in the hallway. The mask had slipped. Her shoulders had sagged. She'd closed her eyes and taken several deep breaths, steadying herself before continuing to her private quarters. Now, as she prepared for another day of public appearances, James positioned himself strategically. He knew the route she would take. He understood the timing of her movements, and he'd made a decision during his sleepless night. If she needed help, if the pressure became too much, if something went wrong, she needed a way to signal him discreetly. A way that wouldn't alert the media, wouldn't create a scandal, wouldn't add to the burden she already carried. That morning, before his shift began, he'd sought her out during a brief private moment. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had established something crucial. A system, a signal. 3 taps of his boot, clearly visible but easily dismissed as a nervous habit or a routine adjustment of his stance. If she saw it, she would know. Help was available. Someone understood. She wasn't as alone as she felt. Catherine had looked at him with an expression he would never forget. Relief, mixed with gratitude, vulnerability barely concealed beneath her practiced composure. She'd nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement of their secret understanding, then returned to her role. But something had shifted. The invisible thread of communication had been established. The engagement that day was at a children's hospital. Catherine excelled at these visits. Her genuine warmth with children wasn't an act. She could spend hours listening to their stories, admiring their artwork, sitting cross-legged on the floor to meet them at eye level. The cameras loved these moments, capturing images of a princess who seemed to genuinely care, who wasn't afraid to wrinkle her expensive clothes, or mess up her perfect hair in service of making a sick child smile. But James noticed what others didn't. The way her breathing had become shallow as they approached the building. The increased frequency with which she touched her necklace. A self-soothing gesture he'd observed before during moments of high stress. The split second of hesitation before she exited the car, as if gathering every ounce of strength for the performance ahead. Inside the hospital, she was magnificent. She met with families, spoke to medical staff, posed for photographs that would appear in tomorrow's papers, with captions about her compassion and dedication. Nobody watching would have guessed that beneath the polished exterior, she was struggling. That the weight of expectation, the constant judgment, the impossible standards had become almost unbearable. James maintained his position, always within sight but never intrusive. He watched the clock, knowing that the engagement was scheduled to last 2 hours. Knowing that sometimes, the longer these events went on, the harder it became to maintain the facade. His boots were polished to a mere shine, as regulations required. His stance was perfect, his expression neutral. But his attention never wavered from the woman, who carried the weight of a nation's expectations on her shoulders. Halfway through the visit, in a quiet corridor between the pediatric wards, Catherine paused. She'd excused herself briefly, citing the need to review notes for the next portion of her visit. But James saw the truth. She was reaching her limit. The smile had become strained. The energy that usually carried her through these engagements was depleting faster than usual. Their eyes met across the corridor. A moment of silent communication, and then, deliberately, carefully, James tapped his boot 3 times against the marble floor. Asterisk, asterisk. The sound echoed in the quiet corridor. Tap, tap, 3 deliberate strikes of boot against marble floor. To anyone passing by, it would seem like nothing more than an officer adjusting his stance. A minor movement in the course of a long duty shift, but Catherine heard it. More importantly, she understood it. Her eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of recognition. The message was clear. James had seen her struggle. He was offering an exit, a lifeline, a way to step back from the overwhelming demands of the moment without causing alarm or speculation. The protocol they'd established that morning was now in action. The decision of what to do next rested entirely with her. Catherine's mind raced through the possibilities. She could acknowledge the signal, allow James to quietly facilitate a brief respite, perhaps citing a scheduling conflict or a necessary phone call. The hospital staff would understand. The media would be managed. Or she could push through, as she'd done countless times before, drawing on reserves of strength that seemed to replenish themselves through sheer force of will and years of conditioning. She thought about the children waiting in the next ward. A little girl named Sophie who'd spent months in treatment and had specifically asked to meet her. A boy named Thomas who'd drawn her a picture that the nurses said he'd worked on for days. These weren't abstract obligations. They were real people with real hopes. Disappointing them felt worse than enduring her own discomfort. But she also thought about sustainability. About the fact that pushing too hard too often eventually led to breaking points. She'd seen it happen to others in similar positions. The public breakdowns, the hospital stays, the retreats from public life that became necessary when someone ignored their limits for too long. The recent months had been particularly demanding. Royal duties, family tensions, relentless media scrutiny, and the constant pressure to be perfect had created a pressure cooker situation that couldn't continue indefinitely. James remained at his post, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully focused on her next move. He'd placed the power entirely in her hands. The signal meant help was available if she wanted it, not that help was being forced upon her. This distinction was crucial. Catherine had so little control over most aspects of her life. Her schedule was determined by others. Her appearance was constantly critiqued. Her words were analyzed and often misinterpreted. Giving her agency in this moment, allowing her to decide whether she needed support, was perhaps the greatest gift James could offer. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually less than 30 seconds, Catherine made her decision. She gave James the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle that anyone not watching specifically for it would have missed it entirely. Then she straightened her shoulders, smoothed her dress, turned toward the aide who was waiting to escort her to the next ward. James understood immediately. She was choosing to continue. The signal had been acknowledged, the support had been recognized, but she was deciding to push forward. However, the dynamic had changed. Now she knew with absolute certainty that if things became too difficult, if the facade became impossible to maintain, she had backup. Someone was watching. Someone understood. Someone would help without judgment or exposure. The rest of the hospital visit proceeded smoothly. Catherine met Sophie, who threw her arms around the princess with the unself-conscious affection only a child could offer. She admired Thomas's drawing, which depicted her as a superhero with a crown. And she spent 20 minutes with a teenager named Emma, who was facing her third round of chemotherapy and needed someone to acknowledge that fear was a normal response to what she was experiencing. These interactions energized Catherine in ways that formal dinners and ceremonial obligations never could. This was the aspect of royal duty that felt meaningful, that justified the sacrifices and the scrutiny. Making a difference in individual lives, using her platform to bring attention and comfort to those who needed it most. By the time she left the hospital, the strain she'd felt earlier had transformed into something more sustainable. But the real impact of that moment in the corridor wasn't about this single engagement. It was about the shift in perspective it represented. For years, Catherine had operated under the assumption that she had to handle everything alone, that showing vulnerability or asking for support was a form of failure. The royal family's traditional approach of maintaining a stiff upper lip and never complaining had been deeply ingrained in her training. James's signal had challenged that assumption. It had opened a door to the possibility that strength didn't mean enduring everything in isolation, that having systems of support wasn't weakness, but wisdom, that acknowledging human limitations was actually more sustainable than pretending they didn't exist. On the drive back to Kensington Palace, Catherine looked out the window at the crowds that had gathered, hoping for a glimpse of her. Their phones were raised, capturing photos and videos that would be shared on social media within minutes. Some faces showed admiration, others simple curiosity. A few held signs expressing support or making requests for her attention to various causes. She wondered what they would think if they knew the truth about that moment in the hospital corridor. Would they see it as scandalous, evidence of inability to handle her role? Or would they recognize it as profoundly human, a reminder that even those who seem to have everything still struggle with the weight of expectation and responsibility? James rode in the security vehicle behind her car, maintaining the professional distance required by protocol. But something had fundamentally changed between them. A line of trust had been established that went beyond the standard protection officer and client relationship. He'd seen her vulnerability and responded not with judgment, but with support. She'd acknowledged her struggle and discovered that doing so didn't lead to catastrophe, but to connection. That evening, after the official duties were complete and the palace had grown quiet, Catherine sat in her private study and reflected on the day. The 3 taps of James's boot kept echoing in her mind. Such a simple gesture, yet it carried profound meaning. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to create a system of support. Someone had given her permission to not be perfect. Every single moment of every single day. Asterisk. The weeks following that first signal brought an unexpected shift in how Catherine approached her duties. She didn't use the 3-tap system again immediately, but knowing it existed changed everything. It was like having a safety net while walking a tightrope. Just the knowledge that it was there made the dangerous journey feel more manageable, even if you never actually fell. James continued his duties with the same professional demeanor he'd always maintained. To outside observers, nothing had changed. He stood at his designated posts, maintained appropriate distance, executed his protection responsibilities with the precision expected of someone in his position. But there was now an additional layer to his vigilance. He wasn't just watching for physical threats to her safety. He was also monitoring her emotional state, recognizing the subtle signs of strain that others missed. The royal calendar showed no mercy. State dinners, charity galas, official tours, family obligations, and media appearances followed one after another with barely time to breathe between them. Catherine navigated this schedule with her characteristic grace, but James noticed the toll it was taking. The slight shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. The way her smile took a fraction of a second longer to appear, the increased frequency of her checking her watch, as if calculating how much longer she needed to endure before she could retreat to privacy. 3 weeks after the hospital visit, the signal was used again, this time at a formal reception at Buckingham Palace. The event was particularly challenging because it combined multiple stressors: high-ranking dignitaries who needed to be impressed, family members whose approval seemed perpetually out of reach, and a media presence that would scrutinize every gesture and expression for days. Afterward, Catherine had been managing well for the first hour. She'd made appropriate small talk with ambassadors, posed for official photographs, and represented the royal family with the poise that had become her trademark. But then she'd overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Two women near the powder room, speaking in voices they thought were private but carried further than they realized. Their words were cruel, questioning her background, her suitability for royal life, suggesting that recent family tensions were somehow her fault. The comments weren't new. She'd heard variations of them for years. But timing mattered, and on this particular night, when she was already stretched thin, the words hit harder than usual. She'd excused herself, stepping into a side corridor where the noise of the reception faded to a manageable background hum. Her breathing had become shallow, her hands were shaking, and she could feel tears threatening despite her best efforts to maintain control. James had followed at a discreet distance. As protocol required, when he saw her distress, he didn't hesitate. 3 clear taps of his boot against the palace's polished floor. The sound cut through her spiraling thoughts, bringing her back to the present moment. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw nothing but steady support reflected there. No judgment, no disappointment, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was hard and that she didn't have to face it alone. This time, she accepted the help more directly. James spoke briefly into his radio, using coded language that wouldn't raise alarms but would communicate the necessary information. Within minutes, Catherine's private secretary appeared with a convenient excuse. An urgent phone call regarding one of the children, nothing serious but requiring her immediate attention. It gave her a legitimate reason to step away without causing speculation or concern. She was gone for 20 minutes, long enough to regain her composure, to wash her face with cold water, to take the deep breaths that her therapist had taught her. When she returned to the reception, most guests hadn't even noticed her absence. Those who had accepted the explanation without question. The evening concluded successfully. The next day's papers praised her elegance and dedication. But Catherine knew the truth. She'd needed help, and she'd been able to ask for it through their silent system. More importantly, accepting that help hadn't led to disaster. The world hadn't ended because she'd acknowledged her humanity. The careful facade hadn't crumbled irreparably. Instead, she'd been able to continue more effectively because she'd taken a moment to care for herself. The system evolved organically over the following months. It wasn't used frequently, perhaps once every few weeks, always in moments when the pressure exceeded Catherine's capacity to manage it alone. Sometimes James would initiate the signal, having observed signs of distress. Other times, Catherine would catch his eye and make a small gesture, a request for him to tap his boot, to remind her that support was available. What made the arrangement work was the mutual respect underlying it. James never abused his position or the trust Catherine had placed in him. He didn't gossip with other staff members, didn't keep records of when the signal was used, didn't treat her vulnerability as entertainment or leverage. He simply provided what she needed, a reliable presence who understood the immense pressure she faced and offered support without strings attached. Catherine, in turn, didn't use the system as an escape from every uncomfortable situation. She continued to push herself, to meet the demanding requirements of her role, to show up day after day despite the challenges. The signal was reserved for genuine moments of crisis, times when continuing without support would have led to more serious problems. Their professional relationship deepened in ways that were difficult to articulate. There was nothing inappropriate about it. James maintained all proper boundaries, never overstepping his role as protection officer. But there was a level of trust and understanding between them that went beyond standard protocol. He'd seen her at her most vulnerable. She knew he would never exploit that knowledge. Other members of the royal household began to notice something different about Catherine. Though they couldn't quite identify what had changed, she seemed more grounded somehow, more present. The brittle quality that had occasionally appeared during particularly stressful periods had softened. She was still working just as hard, still meeting every obligation. But there was a sustainability to her approach that hadn't existed before. The Queen, with her decades of experience reading people and situations, observed these changes with quiet approval. She didn't know the specific details of the support system Catherine and James had established, but she recognized that something positive was happening. The younger woman seemed more confident, more capable of handling the unique pressures of royal life. Whatever adjustments had been made were clearly working. During a private conversation over tea, the Queen mentioned casually that finding the right people to trust was one of the most important skills anyone in their position could develop. She spoke of her own experiences, the moments when she'd needed support but hadn't known how to ask for it, times when pride or protocol had prevented her from accepting help that was offered. Her words weren't specific, but Catherine understood the underlying message. She had the Queen's blessing to continue whatever arrangements were helping her manage. The true test of the system came during what would later be remembered as one of the most challenging periods in Catherine's royal life. A series of family conflicts had become increasingly public, with tabloids publishing intimate details that should have remained private. Every day brought new headlines, new speculation, new invasions of privacy that made even routine activities feel like navigating a minefield. The situation affected everyone in the family differently. Some retreated further into formality and distance. Others became defensive, issuing statements through official channels that often made situations worse rather than better. Catherine found herself caught in the middle, expected to maintain relationships with family members who weren't speaking to each other, to smile for cameras while her personal life was being dissected in the most public ways possible. The pressure manifested in physical symptoms. Headaches became frequent companions. Sleep became elusive, her mind refusing to quiet, even when exhaustion should have made rest inevitable. Her appetite diminished, food losing its appeal when stress seemed to occupy all the space in her stomach. The children noticed something was wrong, asking questions with the innocent directness that children possess. Wanting to know why Mummy seemed sad even when she was smiling, James watched these developments with growing concern. His role was to protect her from physical threats, but what happened when the danger came from stress, from impossible expectations, from the grinding pressure of living under constant scrutiny? He couldn't shield her from newspaper headlines or family tensions. He couldn't make the public less interested in every detail of her life. But he could continue to offer the one thing within his power, a reliable system of support and the reminder that she didn't have to bear everything alone. The crisis point came during a royal tour. These tours were elaborate productions involving months of planning, dozens of engagements scheduled down to the minute, and expectations that every appearance would be perfect. They were exhausting under the best circumstances. During a period of personal turmoil, they became almost unbearable. On the third day of the tour, Catherine was scheduled to give a speech at a women's empowerment conference. The speech was important, addressing issues she cared deeply about, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The previous night, another damaging story had broken in the British press. By morning, it had spread internationally. Her phone had buzzed with messages from concerned friends and advisors, each conversation adding to the weight she was already carrying. Standing backstage, waiting for her introduction, Catherine felt the familiar signs of panic beginning to build. Her heart was racing. Her hands were cold despite the warm venue. The words of her carefully prepared speech seemed to blur on the page in front of her. She could hear the audience beyond the curtain, hundreds of people waiting to hear what she had to say, expecting inspiration and wisdom when she felt like she had nothing left to give. James was positioned near the stage entrance, as he always was during public appearances. He'd seen her face when she arrived at the venue, had noticed the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. He'd also seen the slight trembling in her hands when she thought no one was watching. Their eyes met across the backstage area. Catherine's expression was desperate, a silent plea that transcended their usual subtle communications. She was drowning, and they both knew it. In that moment, the three-tap system wasn't enough. What she needed was more than a brief respite or a convenient excuse. She needed someone to acknowledge that what she was experiencing was real and overwhelming. James made a decision that technically violated protocol. He crossed to where she stood, maintaining professional demeanor, but speaking in a voice low enough that only she could hear. He told her the truth that no one else seemed willing to say. She didn't have to be perfect. Speech didn't have to be flawless. The audience would understand if she showed them something real instead of another perfectly polished performance.
Um,
And if she truly couldn't continue, if the cost of pushing forward was too high,
yes.
then they would find a way to handle the situation. That prioritized her well-being over public expectations. His words cut through the panic. It's not because they solved the underlying problems, but because they reminded her that she had choices. She could deliver the speech as written, drawing on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Could modify her approach, speaking more personally and less formally, sharing some of her struggle in ways that might actually resonate more deeply with the audience. Or she could step back, accepting that even people in her position had limits, and that reaching those limits wasn't a failure. The introduction was beginning. Catherine had seconds to decide. She looked at the printed speech in her hands, then at James, then at the curtain that separated her from the waiting audience. Then she made a choice that surprised both of them. She set the prepared speech aside and walked onto the stage with nothing but her own thoughts and feelings to guide her. What happened next would be talked about for months afterward. Of delivering the polished remarks that had been carefully vetted by multiple advisors, Catherine spoke from the heart. She talked about the pressure women face to be everything to everyone, to never show weakness, to maintain perfect facades, even when falling apart inside. She didn't mention her own situation explicitly, but everyone in the room understood that she was speaking from personal experience. She talked about the importance of building support systems, finding people who could be trusted with vulnerability, of recognizing that asking for help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Her voice shook at times. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But her words were powerful precisely because they were authentic. Because the polished royal facade had cracked just enough to let her humanity show through, the audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But more importantly, Catherine felt something shift inside herself. By choosing honesty over perfection, by allowing herself to be seen as human rather than as an untouchable royal figure, she discovered a new kind of strength. One that didn't depend on maintaining impossible standards, but instead drew power from authenticity and connection. After the speech, back in the privacy of her hotel suite, Catherine allowed herself to fully process what had happened. She cried, releasing months of pent-up stress and fear. James stood guard outside her door, ensuring she had the privacy and time she needed without interference. He didn't try to fix anything or offer platitudes, simply provided what he'd been providing all along: steady, reliable support that asked nothing in return. When she emerged an hour later, face washed and composure restored, she found him still at his post. Their eyes met, and without words, they acknowledged what had passed between them on that stage. The three-tap system had evolved into something deeper. It wasn't just about recognizing distress anymore. It was about creating space for authentic humanity within a system that often denied such things were possible. The speech became a turning point not just for Catherine but for public perception of what modern royalty could be. The video went viral with millions of views within days. Comments poured in from women around the world who saw themselves in her words, who felt validated by a royal figure acknowledging the struggles they faced daily. Media coverage, for once, was overwhelmingly positive. Even the harshest critics seemed temporarily disarmed by her vulnerability and authenticity. But with increased positive attention came new pressures. Everyone wanted more of what that speech had offered. Interview requests flooded in. Organizations sought her patronage, hoping she would bring the same raw honesty to their causes. The very authenticity that had resonated so deeply was in danger of becoming another performance people expected her to deliver on command. Catherine found herself in an ironic position. By being genuine, she'd created new expectations for genuineness that felt just as constraining as the old expectations for perfection had been. People wanted her to be vulnerable, but only in ways that were inspirational rather than messy. They wanted her humanity, but packaged in forms that were comfortable and uplifting rather than difficult or challenging. James observed these developments with mixed feelings. He was proud of Catherine for taking the risk that had led to such positive outcomes, but he also worried about the sustainability of what was being asked of her. Authentic vulnerability couldn't be scheduled or produced on demand. It emerged in specific moments under specific circumstances. And trying to manufacture it would ultimately be just as exhausting as maintaining the perfect facade had been. Their secret signal system continued, but its meaning had subtly shifted. It was no longer just about recognizing when Catherine needed to step back from overwhelming situations. Now it also served as a reminder to stay grounded, to resist the temptation to turn authenticity into another performance, to remember that the value of that speech had come from genuine emotion rather than calculated strategy. Several months after the tour, Catherine faced another significant challenge. This one came from within the royal family itself. There were disagreements about how she should handle her increased profile, debates about whether her more personal approach to public engagements aligned with royal tradition. Some family members felt she'd gone too far, that the carefully maintained distance between royals and public was being eroded in ways that would ultimately prove problematic. A private family meeting was called to discuss these concerns. Catherine knew it would be difficult. She'd be expected to defend her choices, also showing respect for traditions and perspectives she didn't necessarily agree with. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at Windsor Castle, a formal setting that underscored the seriousness of the conversation. James was not present for the meeting itself. His duties didn't extend into private family discussions, but he was stationed nearby, and when Catherine emerged 2 hours later, he immediately recognized the signs of emotional exhaustion. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her jaw, the tightness around her eyes. The meeting had clearly been as difficult as anticipated. She walked past him without acknowledgement, as protocol dictated in the setting, but as she turned the corner toward the private apartments, she paused for just a moment. Long enough to look back, long enough for James to understand that she needed to know the signal system still existed, even here. Even after everything that had changed, he tapped his boot 3 times against the stone floor. The sound echoed in the quiet corridor. Catherine's shoulders dropped slightly, just a fraction, as tension she'd been holding released. Then she continued walking, disappearing from view. But that brief exchange had communicated everything necessary. She wasn't alone. Support was still available. The changes she'd made hadn't cost her the one reliable system she'd built. The conversation at Windsor had not gone as Catherine hoped. While some family members had been supportive, others had been critical. Concerns were raised about maintaining appropriate boundaries, about the dangers of becoming too accessible, about whether her approach was sustainable long-term. No concrete decisions were made, but the implicit message was clear. She needed to be more careful, more controlled, more traditionally royal in her public presentations. Catherine spent the evening grappling with these competing demands. She believed deeply in the value of authentic connection, in showing people that even those in privileged positions faced human struggles and challenges, but she also respected the institution she'd married into, understood that certain traditions existed for reasons, and didn't want her choices to create problems for others in the family. James's 3 taps had reminded her that she didn't have to resolve everything immediately. Some tensions didn't have clear solutions. Some situations required time and patience rather than decisive action. The important thing was maintaining her own center, staying true to her values while also navigating the complex realities of her position. In the weeks that followed, Catherine found a balance. She didn't abandon the more personal approach that had resonated so powerfully with the public, but she also became more strategic about when and how she showed vulnerability. Not every engagement needed to be emotionally intense. Some could be lighter, more traditional, fulfilling expectations for those who preferred royalty to maintain greater distance. The key was authenticity in the moments that truly mattered, while also respecting that not every moment needed to carry the same weight. James noticed these adjustments and approved of them. Catherine was learning what he'd understood from years of protection work. Sustainability required pacing. You couldn't operate at maximum intensity all the time. There needed to be moments of rest, periods of routine, space to recharge between the more demanding challenges. The 3-tap system had always been about recognizing limits and respecting them. Now Catherine was applying that same principle to her public work more broadly. Their professional relationship had matured into something rare and valuable. They'd been through enough together that words were often unnecessary. James could read Catherine's state from across a room. She trusted his judgment about when situations were becoming problematic. They'd developed a language of subtle gestures and small signals that allowed them to communicate without anyone else noticing. Other protection officers noticed the dynamic. Though they didn't understand its full depth, James's approach was studied, analyzed, sometimes imitated. But what made it work wasn't just the tactical elements. It was the genuine care and respect underlying every interaction. He'd never forgotten that beneath the titles and the public role was a real person facing extraordinary pressures. Protecting Catherine meant more than preventing physical harm. It meant helping her maintain the emotional and mental resilience necessary to continue in her role year after year. Catherine, for her part, had learned to value and nurture the support system she'd built. She no longer saw asking for help as weakness or failure. She understood that everyone, regardless of position or privilege, needed people they could rely on. The three-tap signal had taught her that vulnerability could be strength when shared with someone trustworthy. That acknowledging limits was wiser than pretending they didn't exist. Years passed, and the landscape of Catherine's life continued to evolve. The children grew older, requiring different kinds of attention and bringing new challenges alongside the joys. Family dynamics shifted as relationships healed in some areas while remaining complicated in others. The media's fascination with every aspect of her life never fully diminished, though she became more skilled at managing it. Through all these changes, one constant remained: the quiet understanding between Catherine and James. And the signal system that had become so much more than a simple distress code. James had been offered promotions multiple times over the years. Positions that would have meant more prestige, higher pay, different assignments. He turned them all down. When colleagues asked why, he gave vague answers about preferring his current posting. It's about appreciating the routine he'd established. But the truth ran deeper. He'd become invested in Catherine's journey in ways that transcended professional duty. He'd seen her at her lowest moments and watched her develop the strength to navigate impossible situations. Walking away from that felt like abandoning a responsibility he'd taken on the day he first tapped his boot 3 times. Catherine understood his commitment, though they never discussed it directly. Their relationship existed in a space that defied easy categorization. It wasn't friendship in the conventional sense, yet it was more than a standard professional arrangement. They'd shared too much, understood each other too deeply, for it to be reduced to simple job descriptions. He'd held space for her vulnerability without judgment. She'd trusted him with aspects of herself that few others ever saw. That created a bond that, while always appropriate and bounded by professional ethics, was nonetheless profound. The 3-tap signal evolved in subtle ways as years went by. Sometimes it was used in its original form, James recognizing Catherine's distress and offering support. But other times it became a form of communication that transcended crisis, a reminder of shared understanding, an acknowledgement that they were in this together, navigating the complex world of royal duty and public scrutiny as a team. Even if that team existed mostly in moments no one else witnessed, there were lighter moments too. Occasions when Catherine would catch James's eye during particularly absurd situations and see the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, the professional mask slipping just enough to acknowledge the shared awareness of life's ironies. Or times when, after successfully navigating a particularly challenging engagement, she would give him a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you for the support that had made success possible. The system they'd built attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Other members of the royal family, noticing Catherine's resilience and effectiveness, quietly inquired about her approach. How did she manage the pressure so well? What systems did she have in place that allowed her to remain steady when others struggled? Catherine was careful in her responses, never revealing the specific details of her arrangement with James. But she did advocate for the broader principle that everyone needed support systems. That showing vulnerability to trusted individuals wasn't weakness. That sustainable performance required acknowledging human limitations. Some took her advice more seriously than others. A few younger royals began developing their own versions of support networks, finding people they could trust with honest conversations about the challenges they faced. The culture within the family shifted incrementally, becoming slightly more open to acknowledging that public service was hard, that maintaining appearances extracted real costs, that pretending everything was fine when it wasn't ultimately served no one well. James saw these changes with quiet satisfaction. What had begun as a simple system to help one person in crisis had, in some small way, contributed to a broader shift in how royal duty was approached. It wasn't a revolution. The fundamental structures and expectations remained largely unchanged, but there was more room now for humanity, for acknowledging that even extraordinary people faced ordinary struggles. As Catherine approached her 20th year in royal life, she reflected on how far she'd traveled from that young woman, who'd felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectation and scrutiny. The challenges hadn't disappeared. She still faced difficult days, situations that pushed her to her limits, moments when the facade felt almost impossible to maintain. But she'd developed tools and support systems that made those moments manageable. She'd learned that asking for help was strength, that vulnerability could coexist with responsibility, that being human didn't disqualify someone from positions of public significance. The 3 taps of James's boot had become a symbol of something larger than their specific situation. It represented the possibility of finding support in unlikely places, of building trust through consistent presence, of creating systems that honored both duty and humanity. It proved that even within the rigid structures of royal life, with all its protocols and expectations, there was room for genuine human connection and care. James would eventually retire, as everyone must. When that day came, the transition was handled with the same professionalism that had characterized his entire career. There was no dramatic goodbye, no public acknowledgement of what they'd shared. But in a private moment, Catherine thanked him properly. Not just for the protection he'd provided in the conventional sense, but for the deeper service he'd offered, seeing her as fully human, creating space for her vulnerability, and consistently providing support without agenda or judgment. He told her something then that she'd suspected but had never heard articulated, that protecting her had taught him as much as it had helped her, that watching her develop resilience and authenticity in the face of impossible pressures had changed his understanding of what strength really meant, that their arrangement had been valuable not because he'd saved her, but because they'd figured out how to navigate difficult terrain together, each bringing something necessary to the partnership. The signal system didn't end with James's retirement. Catherine carried its lessons forward, finding new ways to build support and acknowledge limitations. She taught her children, as they grew into their own public roles, that having systems of support wasn't optional but essential, that the people who seemed strongest were often those who'd learned to ask for help rather than those who tried to handle everything alone. Years later, when Catherine had become a senior royal herself, a young woman newly married into the family sought her advice. The young woman was struggling with the pressure, feeling isolated and overwhelmed, convinced that showing any vulnerability would be seen as failure. Catherine recognized the familiar patterns immediately. She couldn't give the young woman a protection officer who would tap his boot 3 times. Every situation was unique, requiring tailored solutions. But she could share the underlying principle. Find someone you trust. Absolutely. Create a signal system that allows for honest communication. And remember that acknowledging your humanity isn't incompatible with fulfilling your duties. The young woman asked how. Catherine had survived 2 decades in the spotlight. How she'd maintained her sanity and spirit when so many others had crumbled under similar pressure. Catherine thought about all the factors that had contributed to her resilience. The support of family and friends, the meaning she'd found in her charitable work, the personal growth that came from facing challenges. But among all these elements, one memory stood out with particular clarity, standing in a hospital corridor, feeling like she couldn't take another step, and hearing 3 taps of a boot against marble floor. That moment of recognition and support had changed everything, not because it solved all her problems, but because it reminded her she didn't have to face them entirely alone. The secret signal itself remained mostly private. A few trusted people knew the story, understanding its significance as an example of how support systems could be built, even in the most unlikely circumstances. But the broader lesson became part of Catherine's legacy, that showing humanity wasn't weakness, that asking for help was courage, and that the strength to endure came not from pretending to be invincible, but from building connections that could support you. Through inevitable moments of vulnerability, James's 3 taps had been a simple gesture, easily overlooked by anyone not watching for it. But in that simplicity lay profound power. It proved that sometimes the most meaningful support comes not from grand gestures or elaborate interventions, but from consistent, quiet presence and the willingness to see and respond to another person's struggle. It showed that everyone, regardless of position or privilege, needs someone who will notice when they're drowning and offer a lifeline without judgment. And it demonstrated that within even the most constrained situations, human connection and authentic care can find ways to flourish.